Well, good Monday to you. Welcome to another episode of Monday Motions, where we look at ways that we can step into our week intentionally, living the lives that we've been given rather than just going through the motions that so often just carry us along. So this morning I want to tell you a story about a guy named Thomas Jefferson. Probably heard of him. He was famous for many, many different things, but one of the things that he was famous for during his time, and people haven't necessarily heard of this many hundred years later, was that he was meticulous in keeping records. This guy kept track of everything, which for historians and biographers is brilliant. They can go back and see the details of his life in almost to the point of absurdity. He kept fantastic financial records. We can go back now, anyone, to look at these records and see, like, on a specific day he bought a chicken for this many cents and spent this many cents on salt at the store. I mean, it's just to the point of absurdity. He kept track of everything, every detail, every cent that went out or came in through his plantation, his businesses. This guy kept track of everything, which, to the shock of probably everyone, including his own family, on his death, they found out that even though he kept such fantastic financial records, his finances, when he died, left his family with crippling debt. They had to sell Monticello in order to cover the bills, and he didn't leave his family in abject poverty or anything, but certainly with far less than they would have expected from a man that had done so much for his country, had so much money passed through his hands over the years, and also kept such perfect records. I mean, it's the idea. You keep budget, you keep track of things, and automatically things are going to kind of work out better, right? But the reality is that we see that he didn't experience the benefits of his meticulous record keeping. And I think one of the reasons is that he didn't open those records to anybody else. He thought that he was on the right track and didn't let anyone else into the process, and found out too late that he was fantastically off the track, and his family paid dearly for that. It's not good for man to be alone, the Bible says, is it? The reality is that we don't always make great decisions on our own. And in this kind of hyper-individualized culture that we all are born into here in the West, sometimes we forget how much we have in common when we watch the news cycle or get into arguments with people on social media, that there's really so much that we do have in common here in the West. Ironically, one of the biggest things we have in common is that we don't like to get along with other people. We don't want to control them necessarily, but we certainly don't want them controlling us. And so we kind of close in, we keep things tight, we keep things secret, whether that's our finances or our personal struggles, our relationships with people around us or at church, or ultimately our relationship with God himself. We keep these things so private that oftentimes we miss out on the blessing of what the Bible says. And this is the promise. It says there is safety in a multitude of counselors. That though we certainly want to keep our conscience intact and follow where we think God is leading us, the Bible makes it clear over and over and over that life is a team sport. And that not only do we do better when we work with others, but that we set ourselves up for profound blessings. And the Bible says literally safety, that when we allow others into the process, things can change. The Bible calls Moses the most humble man on earth, which is really funny because, many people believe he wrote this book. So if he was the one that wrote that about himself, he's hardly humble if he's claiming to be the most humble person on earth. So it makes sense someone else added that little bit after his life, looking back. But the reality is, I think it is a fair reality to call Moses humble. But you don't think about humility when you watch him living his life, do you? I mean, this guy was powerful. This guy did amazing things for the children of Israel in the name of God. He split open the sea, marched through, led armies into battle, and faced crazy drama from his own family to the point of having to curse them with leprosy for a while. That's a nice gift to have. You don't listen to me? Leprosy for you. So Moses is not some sort of a weakling, and yet the Bible calls him humble, which is confusing for some people when we misunderstand what the biblical definition of humility is. It's literally the same word to describe a humble person as the Bible uses to describe a well-trained horse. A horse that has been well trained has lost none of its power, none of its abilities, none of its ability to think for itself, even to do what if it's terrified, it's still going to jump back from that snake, even if you're telling it to go forward. The horse hasn't given up its ability to interact with the world. And yet it has accepted the role of doing something for somebody else, living its life not just for its own dictates, but to allow itself to be led by somebody else. And that is the definition of biblical humility. It doesn't mean you give up your thinking. It doesn't mean you give up your strength and become a weakling and don't exert your own thoughts and perspective into a situation, or push back when you believe someone's misleading you. But it does mean giving ourselves over to the guidance of someone outside of ourselves. And that is terrifying, I think, for most humans. But especially for those of us, again, in the West who have grown up not only in hyper-individualized American culture, but as Protestants who agree that we're not supposed to give over ourselves to the leading of somebody else. We're supposed to follow our own conscience. And though that's true, I believe that misses part of the blessing that God offers us in spiritual community. As we talk about putting down roots, to put down roots into a spiritual community, to allow ourselves to be guided by somebody outside of our own thinking, to allow others to speak into our life and give us guidance and wisdom, not just follow the own things that are kind of going on in our head. So we go back to Moses. The Bible says he was the most humble man on earth. This guy, the Bible says that God spoke directly to him in a way that he didn't even speak to most of the prophets. He said, like a friend, face to face. So that's Moses with wisdom and training in Egypt before he even fled Egypt in the first place. This guy is probably the most educated man, most educated person within hundreds or thousands of miles of wherever he's at. And yet the Bible says that when he was setting up the plan with the children of Israel, moving them around, his father-in-law Jethro shows up and says to Moses, Moses, you're doing this all wrong. You need to organize things differently. You can't do it all yourselves. You need other people to be able to pass on some of this authority and responsibility to. And Moses, a man that talks directly to God, is humble enough to admit that he is wrong, his father-in-law is right, and he implements the plan. He doesn't say he got it from God. He doesn't say he got it in a vision. He didn't think it up himself. He listened to someone who was trying to speak into his life and was humble enough to be guided by someone outside of himself. If Moses could do it, as someone who talks directly face-to-face with God, certainly you and I could be blessed by letting someone else speak into our lives, couldn't we? There's a story of Michael Jordan. And Michael Jordan, the famous basketball player, was known for, if anything as much almost as basketball, he was known for being a fan of Nike. Nike blessed his life extravagantly, and he blessed Nike as well in return. It was a very mutually beneficial relationship. But he was committed to Nike. Everyone knew that. All his friends around him knew that, and they agreed. I mean, he gave them free stuff. This guy was just like, you're my friend, you're Nike all the way, or we're not friends. And they're like, all right, cool, we're in, right? He loved Nike. So it makes sense when he showed up at one of his friend's house, who was also an NBA player as well, and looked in this man's house. He noticed some shoes with a Puma signature on it. And he's like, what in the world, or emblem? And he saw another one, that's some other clothes. He found all this Puma gear, which this guy had been given by Puma, trying to lure him over. And the guy thought, I'll just keep it. Michael Jordan gathered all this stuff up and just destroyed it, throws it in the trash, and looks at his friend. He said, don't ever let me find anything but Nike in your house again. There's no time to ride the fence. You got to commit. And his friend knew he was right. And Michael Jordan said, hey, here's the number of my buddy over at Nike. Call him up. He'll replace all this stuff with Nike gear. Don't ever let me see you playing fool again like this. And the man listened. How often would we have been blessed in our lives if we had put roots down into people in relationships who we could look at their lives and say, I want to be like that person. I'm going to let them give me advice. I'm going to let them speak into my life. There's a saying that says, don't ever accept criticism from somebody you wouldn't accept advice from. And I think that's wise as we talk about this reality. Look at people that you respect, that you would accept advice from. Ask advice. Listen to their criticism. There's always people that are willing to speak into our lives to try and guide us, that aren't interested in our goals, aren't interested in our well-being. It's something with their own issues. They're trying to just push us into some other situation. Don't listen to them. Just let it roll off. But where are you putting down your roots today? In spiritual community, in religious friends that have lives you'd like to emulate? My prayer for us today is that we would put down those roots, that we wouldn't close the books off from other people like Jefferson. But we would open up our lives like the friends of Michael Jordan and let our lives be spoken into. If someone as powerful and connected with God as Moses could benefit from a multitude of counselors, certainly you and I can as well. So may you put your roots down deep. May you take the risk of opening yourself up to someone speaking into your life from outside and experience the blessing of the multitude of counselors that you've put your roots down deep into relationship with.